I didn't expect them to fire me for being too old. Just 3 weeks after my breakthrough in neural interface technology generated the largest licensing deal in MindBridge Dynamics' 15-year history. But that's not where the story begins. It begins on the night I stood in Laboratory 7, watching my prototype respond to human thought patterns for the first time, and I knew I had just changed the world. The soft blue glow of the monitoring screens cast shadows across my weathered hands as I adjusted the final calibration settings. 27 years in biomedical engineering, 12 patents to my name, and countless 18-hour days had led to this moment. The neural interface prototype hummed quietly on the stainless steel table, its microscopic sensors barely visible to the naked eye. At 62, I had poured every ounce of my experience into this project, drawing from knowledge accumulated through decades of working with traumatic brain injury patients during my military service and years of civilian research afterward. Sarah Chen, my young research partner, leaned over the computer terminal, her fingers dancing across the keyboard with the kind of energy that only comes from being 28 and believing the future belongs to you. She had been assigned to my team 6 months earlier, fresh out of MIT with a PhD in neuroscience and eyes that sparkled with theoretical knowledge. What she lacked in practical experience, she made up for in enthusiasm and computational skills that complemented my hardware expertise perfectly. Dr. Martinez, the baseline readings are stable, she announced, her voice tight with anticipation. We're ready for the first human trial. I had volunteered to be the test subject myself, despite the protests from the younger members of my team. They thought I was being reckless, but I knew something they didn't. This wasn't just about scientific advancement for me. This was about the men and women I had served with, the ones who came home with invisible wounds that traditional medicine couldn't touch. The ones who stared at walls for hours, trapped in their own minds, while their families watched helplessly from the outside. The interface felt cool against my temple as Sarah secured it with medical tape. We had spent months perfecting the non-invasive design, ensuring that the sensors could detect neural activity without requiring surgical implantation. The breakthrough had come to me during a sleepless night 3 months earlier, when I realized that we were thinking about brain-computer interfaces all wrong. Instead of trying to penetrate the skull, we needed to work with the brain's natural electromagnetic field, amplifying and interpreting signals that were already there. Beginning neural pattern recognition sequence, I said into the recording device, my voice steady despite the hammering of my heart. Subject is Dr. Elena Martinez, age 62, 27 years of biomedical engineering experience, former U.S. Army medical research officer. The first sensation was subtle, like a whisper at the edge of consciousness. The interface began to map my neural pathways, learning the unique signature of my thoughts. On the monitor, colorful patterns bloomed and shifted, representing the electrical activity in my brain in real time. But this wasn't just passive observation. This was communication. I focused on a simple command, lifting my right hand. On the screen, a robotic arm that we had connected to the system began to move, mirroring my intention before I had even consciously decided to move my own hand. The response was immediate, intuitive, as if I had gained a new limb that existed in the digital realm. Sarah gasped, her eyes wide with wonder. Dr. Martinez, the response time is under 50 milliseconds. That's faster than human reflexes. But I was already thinking bigger. I concentrated on more complex commands, watching as the interface learned to interpret not just motor intentions, but emotional states, memory recalls, even abstract concepts. The system was adapting to me, growing more sophisticated with each passing moment. This wasn't just a brain-computer interface. This was a bridge between human consciousness and digital possibility. For the next 4 hours, we pushed the boundaries of what the prototype could do. We tested its ability to control multiple devices simultaneously, to process complex mathematical calculations by interfacing directly with computer systems, to translate emotional states into visual art through connected graphics software. With each successful test, I felt a deep satisfaction that went beyond professional accomplishment. This was my life's work, the culmination of everything I had learned and experienced. Perfection, the possibilities were staggering. Veterans with paralysis could control prosthetics with unprecedented precision. Patients with severe depression could have their neural patterns monitored and adjusted in real time. People with memory disorders could supplement their biological recall with digital storage systems. The applications extended far beyond medical treatment into education, entertainment, and human enhancement. By 3 in the morning, Sarah and I were exhausted but exhilarated. The prototype had exceeded our most optimistic projections. We had documented 17 successful neural interface protocols, each one representing a potential breakthrough in human-computer interaction. I carefully removed the interface from my temple, my hands trembling slightly from fatigue and adrenaline. "We did it," Sarah whispered, her voice filled with awe. "We actually did it." I looked at the data stream scrolling across the monitors, at the robot arm that had become an extension of my own body, at the graphs showing neural patterns that had been translated into digital commands with startling accuracy. This was more than a scientific achievement. This was the future, and I had helped create it. The laboratory fell silent except for the gentle hum of cooling systems and the soft beeping of monitoring equipment. I stood there, surrounded by the tools of my trade, feeling the weight of discovery settling on my shoulders. At 62, when many of my peers were planning retirement, I had just opened a door that would change the relationship between human minds and digital systems forever. I had no way of knowing that in less than a month, that same achievement would be used as evidence that I was no longer aligned with the company's innovative vision, that my age would be framed as a liability rather than an asset, that the neural interface technology I had birthed would be handed over to a team of younger engineers who would take credit for my breakthrough. But on that night, standing in the soft glow of the laboratory lights, I felt invincible. I felt like I had finally proven that experience and wisdom could still change the world. I felt like I belonged exactly where I was, doing exactly what I had always been meant to do. The betrayal would come later. The humiliation would come later. The moment when I realized that my own creation would be used to justify my dismissal was still weeks away. But the foundation for everything that followed was laid in that laboratory, in those 4 hours, when I reached across the boundary between human and machine and showed them how to speak to each other. The neural interface project had consumed 3 years of my life, but those 3 years represented only the visible tip of a much deeper commitment. The real investment had begun long before I ever stepped foot in MindBridge Dynamics' gleaming research facility. It had started in a military hospital in Germany, where I watched a 23-year-old soldier named Marcus struggle to remember his daughter's name after a roadside bomb had stolen pieces of his mind. I had been serving as a medical research officer then, part of a specialized unit tasked with developing battlefield medical technologies. Marcus had been my patient, my responsibility, and my failure. Traditional treatments couldn't bridge the gap between his damaged neural pathways and the memories trapped on the other side. I spent months working with him, trying every conventional approach in our medical arsenal, but nothing could restore what the explosion had taken away. The night Marcus died, not from his physical injuries, but from the despair of being trapped in his own broken mind, I made a promise to his photograph. I would find a way to rebuild what war had destroyed. I would create a bridge between damaged minds and the digital tools that could supplement their function. That promise had cost me my marriage, my social life, and nearly 2 decades of pursuing something that most of my colleagues considered impossible. When I left the Army in 2008, I had turned down lucrative offers from 3 major pharmaceutical companies to accept a research position at MindBridge Dynamics. The salary was 60% less than what I could have earned elsewhere, but MindBridge was one of the few companies willing to invest in brain-computer interface research. Dr. Harrison Webb, the company's founder, had been intrigued by my military research and had promised me the resources and freedom to pursue my vision. Those early years had been brutal. I worked 16-hour days, 7 days a week, slowly building the theoretical foundation for what would eventually become the neural interface. My tiny apartment near the research facility became little more than a place to shower and grab a few hours of sleep. I missed my nephew's wedding, my sister's 50th birthday, and countless family gatherings because I was always in the lab, always chasing the next breakthrough. The personal costs had been staggering. My ex-husband, David, had left me in 2011, unable to compete with what he called my obsession with broken minds. He had begged me to take a normal job, to start a family, to live a life that didn't revolve around neural pathways and computer algorithms. But I couldn't explain to him that every day I delayed was another day that veterans like Marcus suffered in silence. I had emptied my savings account 4 times to fund additional research when company budgets ran short. I had sold my mother's jewelry, cashed in my retirement accounts, and taken out loans against my condo to pay for specialized equipment that MindBridge couldn't afford. The neural interface sensors alone had cost me $38,000 of my own money. Money I had scraped together by working consulting jobs on weekends and holidays. My health had suffered too. The constant stress and irregular eating habits had triggered a mild heart condition that required medication. I had developed chronic insomnia, surviving on 3 to 4 hours of sleep per night for months at a time. My hands had developed a slight tremor from caffeine overuse and nervous exhaustion. At my last physical, Dr. Patterson had warned me that I was pushing my body beyond its limits. The intellectual investment had been equally demanding. I had taught myself 3 new programming languages, mastered advanced neuroscience concepts that hadn't existed when I was in graduate school, and forced my aging brain to keep pace with technological advances that seemed to accelerate every month. While my younger colleagues attended conferences and networking events, I spent my evenings reading research papers and teaching myself skills that most people half my age struggled to master. I had sacrificed relationships that might have sustained me through the difficult years. My friendship with Dr. Patricia Holmes, my closest colleague from my Army days, had withered because I never had time for the dinners and phone calls that maintained connections. My relationship with my sister Carmen had become strained because I consistently chose work over family obligations. Even my relationship with my aging father had suffered because I was always too busy to drive the 2 hours to visit him at his assisted living facility. The opportunity costs haunted me during the darkest moments. I could have been a department head at any major university, earning tenure and respect while leading a team of graduate students. I could have been a senior researcher at a pharmaceutical company, drawing a 6-figure salary while developing treatments for common neurological conditions. Instead, I had chosen to chase an impossible dream at a small company that most people had never heard of. But every sacrifice had been purposeful, every loss had been in service of something greater than myself. When I worked through Christmas morning in 2018, calibrating sensors while my family gathered around their dinner table without me, I thought about the thousands of brain injury survivors who might benefit from my research. When I spent my 50th birthday alone in the laboratory, debugging code instead of celebrating with friends, I reminded myself that Marcus would never have another birthday because we hadn't been able to save him. The neural interface had demanded everything I had to give. It had required me to become an expert in fields that hadn't existed when I started my career. It had forced me to collaborate with researchers young enough to be my children, swallowing my pride when they questioned my methods or dismissed my experience. It had demanded that I prove myself again and again, in an industry that increasingly valued youth and innovation over wisdom and persistence. Sarah Chen, brilliant as she was, had no idea what those 3 years had cost me. She saw the successful prototype and the breakthrough technology, but she hadn't lived through the failures, the setbacks, the moments when the entire project seemed impossible. She hadn't invested her life savings, her health, her relationships, and her reputation in a vision that most people considered science fiction. The neural interface wasn't just my professional achievement, it was my life's work, my legacy, my redemption, for every patient I hadn't been able to save. It represented every sacrifice I had made, every relationship I had lost, every comfortable path I had chosen not to take. It was the tangible proof that my decades of experience and my willingness to risk everything had been worth it. The validation came in waves, each one more overwhelming than the last. 3 weeks after our successful prototype demonstration, Dr. Harrison Webb summoned me to his corner office on the 42nd floor, where floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping view of the city's skyline. He sat behind his mahogany desk, a man in his early 50s with silver hair and the kind of confident bearing that came from building a company from nothing into a biotech powerhouse. "Elena," he said, gesturing to the leather chair across from his desk, "I've just finished reviewing the preliminary data from your neural interface trials. The results are extraordinary." The folder he slid across the desk contained pages of analysis that I had memorized, but seeing them presented in MindBridge's official format gave them a weight that made my chest tighten with pride. Response times averaging 47 milliseconds. Accuracy rates exceeding 96% across all test protocols. Neural pattern recognition that improved by 15% with each session. These weren't just numbers. They were proof that everything I had sacrificed had been worth it. The board met yesterday, Dr. Webb continued, his voice carrying the kind of gravity reserved for life-changing announcements. We're immediately fast-tracking your technology for clinical trials. The FDA pre-approval process begins next month. I had expected this, had hoped for it, but hearing it spoken aloud felt like standing at the edge of a cliff and realizing you could fly. Clinical trials meant real patients, real applications, real lives that could be transformed by the technology I had created. It meant that Marcus's death had not been in vain, that the promise I had made to his photograph might actually be kept. But Dr. Webb wasn't finished. We've also received an unprecedented licensing inquiry from Therapeutic Dynamics. They want exclusive rights to your neural interface technology for their new veteran rehabilitation program. Therapeutic Dynamics. The name alone commanded respect in the biomedical industry. They were the company that had revolutionized prosthetics, that had developed the cochlear implant improvements that had restored hearing to millions of people worldwide. They were the gold standard for medical technology, and they wanted my work. The licensing agreement, Dr. Webb said, opening a second folder, is worth $47 million over 5 years. It's the largest technology licensing deal in MindBridge's history. The number hung in the air between us like a physical presence. $47 million. Not just for the company, but validation that my neural interface technology was worth more than most people would earn in several lifetimes. It was a figure that represented not just financial success, but recognition from the most respected minds in the field that what I had created was genuinely revolutionary. The next morning brought a flood of emails from colleagues across the industry. Dr. Jennifer Park from Stanford's neuroscience department wrote to congratulate me and request a collaboration on expanding the technology for pediatric applications. Dr. Michael Robertson from Johns Hopkins wanted to discuss incorporating my interface into their spinal cord injury research program. Dr. Lisa Chen from the Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Los Angeles sent a 3-page letter detailing how the technology could transform treatment for the 30,000 veterans currently receiving care for traumatic brain injuries. The most meaningful message came from Dr. Patricia Holmes, my old colleague from the Army Medical Research Unit. Elena, she wrote, I just saw the announcement about your neural interface breakthrough. Marcus would be so proud. You kept your promise. Those 4 words, you kept your promise, meant more to me than the licensing deal, more than the board's approval, more than all the congratulations from industry leaders. They meant that the 23-year-old soldier who had died in that German hospital had not been forgotten, that his struggle had contributed to something that would help others avoid his fate. The technical validation was equally satisfying. The peer review process for the Journal of Biomedical Engineering had been rigorous, with 3 independent review boards examining every aspect of my research. The lead reviewer, Dr. Amanda Foster from MIT, had called the neural interface a paradigm shift in human-computer interaction that will define the next generation of assistive medical technology. The journal's editor had fast-tracked publication, something that happened perhaps once every 5 years for truly groundbreaking research. When the article appeared in print, it generated immediate response from the international scientific community. Requests for speaking engagements poured in from conferences in London, Tokyo, and Berlin. The European Journal of Neuroscience wanted to feature my work on their cover. The National Science Foundation added my research to their list of transformative technologies for the 21st century. But the achievement that meant the most came from an unexpected source. Dr. Sarah Williams, the director of the Wounded Warrior Neural Recovery Program, called me personally to discuss implementing my technology in their treatment centers. She explained that they had been following my research for 2 years, waiting for the breakthrough that would finally allow them to help the most severely injured veterans. Dr. Martinez, she said, her voice filled with the kind of excitement that only comes from seeing a solution to a problem you've worked on for decades. Your neural interface technology could help thousands of veterans who are currently considered untreatable. We're talking about giving people their lives back. The clinical applications were staggering. Veterans with paralysis could control prosthetic limbs with unprecedented precision. Soldiers with traumatic brain injuries could supplement their damaged neural pathways with digital processing. Service members with severe PTSD could have their emotional states monitored and stabilized in real time. The technology I had created in Laboratory 7 could address virtually every type of neural trauma that modern warfare inflicted. Wooly. The financial recognition followed quickly. MindBridge immediately approved a 30% salary increase, bringing my compensation to the highest level in the company's history. They also granted me a percentage of the licensing revenue, ensuring that I would personally benefit from the commercial success of my invention. The bonus structure meant that the technology's success was directly tied to my own financial security. More importantly, the company announced the establishment of the Dr. Elena Martinez Neural Interface Research Division, with me as its director. I would have my own team of 12 researchers, a dedicated laboratory facility, and an annual budget of $8 million. At 62, I was finally being given the resources and recognition that my decades of experience deserved. The media attention was overwhelming. Biotech Today featured me on their cover as Innovator of the Year. The Wall Street Journal published a profile titled, "The Veteran Who Revolutionized Brain-Computer Interfaces." National Public Radio interviewed me for their Science Heroes series. Suddenly, everyone wanted to know about the older female engineer who had achieved what younger, more celebrated researchers had been unable to accomplish. Standing in my newly expanded laboratory, surrounded by equipment that represented the culmination of my life's work, I felt a satisfaction that went beyond professional achievement. I had proven that experience and persistence could still change the world. I had shown that wisdom earned through decades of service was as valuable as youthful enthusiasm. I had demonstrated that the promise made to a dying soldier could be kept, even if it took 20 years to fulfill. The conference room on the 38th floor had always felt like a sanctuary to me. Its polished cherrywood table reflected the soft morning light filtering through the panoramic windows, and the walls displayed framed patents and awards that represented MindBridge's greatest achievements. My own neural interface patent hung prominently near the head of the table, a reminder of the company's commitment to innovation and excellence. I arrived 15 minutes early for what I believed was a routine quarterly review meeting, carrying my leather portfolio containing performance metrics, research updates, and a detailed proposal for expanding the neural interface program. The Therapeutic Dynamics licensing deal had been finalized just last week, and I expected this meeting to focus on scaling our research division and planning the next phase of clinical trials. Jessica Thompson, MindBridge's Chief Technology Officer, was already seated when I entered. At 34, she embodied everything the tech industry celebrated: sharp intelligence, ruthless ambition, and an MBA from Wharton that she wielded like a weapon. Her auburn hair was styled in a precise bob that never moved, and her designer suit suggested someone who had never spent a night sleeping on a laboratory floor. "Elena," she said, her voice carrying the kind of artificially warm tone that immediately put me on guard. "Thank you for coming. Please, have a seat." I settled into my usual chair, the one where I had presented countless research updates and defended budget allocations for the neural interface program. The leather felt familiar beneath my hands, and I placed my portfolio on the table with the confidence of someone who had never had reason to doubt their place in this room. Dr. Webb entered moments later, but something was different about his demeanor. Gone was the enthusiastic energy he had displayed when discussing the licensing deal. Instead, he moved with the careful, measured steps of a man carrying uncomfortable news. He nodded at me politely but avoided making direct eye contact. "Elena," Jessica began, consulting a tablet computer with the practiced efficiency of someone who had rehearsed this moment. "We've asked you here today to discuss some organizational changes that will be taking effect immediately." The word "immediately" sent a chill through my chest, but I maintained my composure. 27 years of military training had taught me to remain calm under pressure, to never show weakness when facing an uncertain situation. "As you know," Jessica continued, "MindBridge has been undergoing a comprehensive strategic review. The board has determined that we need to restructure our research division to align with current market dynamics and technological trends." I opened my portfolio, intending to reference the success metrics from the neural interface program, but Jessica held up a perfectly manicured hand to stop me. "Elena, your contributions to this company have been valuable, particularly your work on the neural interface project. However, the board has concluded that our research division needs to move in a different direction. A more agile, forward-thinking direction. The words hit me like physical blows. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice steady despite the confusion flooding my mind. "Are you suggesting that the neural interface program isn't forward-thinking? We just secured the largest licensing deal in company history." Dr. Webb shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his fingers drumming against the polished wood table. "Elena, this isn't about the quality of your work. It's about positioning MindBridge for the future. We need researchers who can adapt quickly to emerging technologies, who can pivot rapidly when market conditions change." "I've been adapting to emerging technologies for 3 decades, I replied, my tone sharpening. "I've mastered programming languages that didn't exist when I started my career. I've integrated artificial intelligence, machine learning, and quantum computing principles into my research. How is that not adapting?" Jessica's expression remained professionally neutral, but I caught a flicker of something that looked like pity in her eyes. "Elena, I think you're missing the point. This isn't about your technical abilities. It's about cultural fit." "Cultural fit?" The phrase felt foreign in my mouth, like speaking a language I had never learned. "The biotech industry is changing rapidly," Dr. Webb explained, his voice carrying the rehearsed quality of someone who had practiced this speech. "We need team members who can connect with younger demographics, who understand social media marketing, who can communicate complex scientific concepts to millennial investors and Generation Z consumers." I stared at him, processing the implications of what he was saying. "You're firing me because I'm too old." "That's absolutely not what we're saying," Jessica interjected quickly, her legal training evident in the careful parsing of her words. "We're restructuring the research division to optimize for innovation velocity and market responsiveness. Your role is being eliminated as part of this strategic realignment." "And who will be taking over the neural interface program?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "Dr. Sarah Chen has been promoted to Senior Research Director," Jessica announced. "She'll be leading a new integrated research team that combines neuroscience, artificial intelligence, and user experience design." Sarah Chen. My research partner, my protégé, the brilliant young woman who had learned everything she knew about neural interfaces from watching me work. At 28, she was exactly the kind of researcher that MindBridge wanted to represent their future. Young, energetic, and untainted by the accumulated wisdom that apparently made me obsolete. "Sarah is certainly talented," I said carefully, "but she has no experience leading a research division. She's never managed a team, never negotiated with regulatory agencies, never dealt with the complexities of clinical trial approval." "She'll learn," Dr. Webb said dismissively. "Young people adapt quickly. Besides, we'll be providing her with additional support staff and consulting resources." The casual cruelty of his words was breathtaking. 27 years of experience, dismissed as easily as outdated software. Decades of accumulated knowledge, treated as a liability rather than an asset. The neural interface technology that had generated $47 million in licensing revenue, apparently less valuable than the youthful enthusiasm of someone who had assisted with its development. "There's a generous severance package," Jessica added, sliding a manila envelope across the table. 6 months of salary, full benefits continuation, and a positive reference letter. We're also prepared to help with your transition to consulting work or early retirement. Early retirement. The phrase hung in the air like a verdict. At 62, I was being told that my productive years were over, that my expertise was no longer needed, that my place in the industry I had helped shape was being eliminated to make room for younger, more culturally aligned researchers. "I need to understand something," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "The neural interface technology that just generated the largest licensing deal in company history was developed by someone who is apparently too old to continue working here. How do you reconcile that contradiction?" Dr. Webb and Jessica exchanged glances, and I saw the moment they realized I wasn't going to accept their decision quietly. Jessica's professional mask slipped slightly, revealing the calculation beneath. "Elena, you're taking this personally, and I understand that. But business decisions aren't personal. They're strategic. The neural interface project was successful, but it's also complete. We need people who can generate the next breakthrough, not people who are still focused on past achievements. The insult was so perfectly delivered, so precisely aimed, that I almost admired its efficiency. My life's work, reduced to a past achievement. My decades of experience, reframed as an inability to generate future innovations. My age, transformed from a source of wisdom into evidence of obsolescence. I stood slowly, leaving the severance package untouched on the table. I assume my access to the laboratory will be terminated immediately. Security will escort you to collect your personal items, Jessica confirmed. Your company laptop and phone will need to be returned, of course. As I walked toward the door, I turned back one final time. You might want to review the intellectual property agreements on the neural interface technology. Very carefully. The look of confusion that passed between Dr. Webb and Jessica was the only satisfaction I would take from that room. They had no idea what they had just done, no understanding of the legal complexities surrounding my research, no awareness of the mistake they had just made. But I did. The security escort felt like a perverse honor guard. 2 uniformed guards flanked me as I walked through the corridors I had traversed thousands of times, past laboratories where I had spent countless nights perfecting my research, past offices where colleagues I had worked with for years carefully avoided making eye contact. The sound of my heels against the polished floor echoed with a finality that seemed to announce my departure to everyone we passed. I moved through the building like a ghost, visiting the scenes of her former life. The 20-minute walk to my laboratory felt endless, each step carrying me further from the identity I had built over decades. The guards said nothing, but their presence transformed every familiar hallway into foreign territory. I was no longer Dr. Elena Martinez, Senior Research Director. I was a terminated employee, being processed for removal. My laboratory looked smaller somehow, as if the walls had contracted while I was in that conference room having my career dismantled. The equipment I had fought to purchase, the workstation I had customized for my specific research needs, the whiteboards covered with equations and diagrams that represented months of problem solving, all of it suddenly felt like borrowed space that had never truly belonged to me. The personal items I was allowed to collect fit into a single cardboard box. 27 years of professional life, reduced to a handful of photographs, a coffee mug my sister had given me for my 50th birthday, and a small cactus that had somehow survived on my windowsill despite my irregular watering schedule. I lifted each item slowly, hyper-aware of the guards watching my every movement, ensuring I didn't take anything that might be considered company property. My diploma from MIT, which had hung on the wall behind my desk for 8 years, went into the box. The photo of me shaking hands with the Secretary of Defense after receiving the Army's Medal for Scientific Achievement joined it. The small American flag that had draped my father's coffin during his military funeral was carefully folded and placed beside the other remnants of my career. The most painful item was a framed letter from a veteran named Robert Kim, who had been one of the first test subjects for an early version of my neural interface technology. He had written to thank me for giving him hope when the medical establishment had told him his traumatic brain injury was untreatable. The letter had sustained me through the darkest periods of my research, reminding me why the work mattered. Now it felt like evidence of a life I would never live again. As I packed, muscle memory guided my hands while my mind struggled to process what had just happened. The meeting replayed in endless loops, each iteration revealing new layers of humiliation. The careful choreography of Jessica's words, the rehearsed quality of Dr. Webb's explanations, the manila envelope containing my severance package. All of it had been planned, orchestrated, executed with the precision of a military operation. They had waited until the licensing deal was finalized, until the neural interface technology was safely secured under MindBridge's intellectual property portfolio, until my value had been extracted and monetized. Only then had they decided I was expendable, too old, culturally misaligned with their vision of the future. The guards waited patiently as I closed the box, their silent presence a constant reminder that I was no longer trusted in the building where I had once worked with complete autonomy. One of them, a younger man with kind eyes, offered to carry the box for me. I declined, needing to maintain some semblance of dignity in a situation designed to strip it away. Walking through the lobby felt like crossing a bridge that was burning behind me. The marble floors, the soaring ceiling, the wall of awards and achievements that included my own contributions. All of it was being erased from my personal history with each step toward the exit. Colleagues in the lobby glanced at me and quickly looked away, recognizing the universal signs of termination and wanting no association with my suddenly toxic presence. The automatic doors opened with a soft whisper, and suddenly I was outside, standing on the concrete steps of the building that had been my second home for over a decade. The afternoon sun felt harsh against my face, and I squinted against the brightness, realizing I had spent so much time in windowless laboratories that I had forgotten what natural light felt like. I stood there for several minutes, clutching my cardboard box, unsure of what to do next. My car was in the parking garage, but going there would mean walking past more colleagues, enduring more awkward glances, facing more evidence of my sudden irrelevance. The thought of sitting in traffic, of driving home to an empty apartment, of beginning whatever came after the end of my career felt overwhelming. The city moved around me with indifferent efficiency. People walked past, discussing their lunch plans, their weekend activities, their mundane concerns that suddenly seemed impossibly precious. They had jobs to return to, careers that extended beyond today, futures that stretched further than a 6-month severance package. I envied their certainty, their stability, their ignorance of how quickly everything could change. My phone buzzed with a text message from Sarah Chen. "Dr. Martinez, I just heard about the restructuring. I'm so sorry, I had no idea this was happening. Can we talk?" I stared at the message, trying to decode its meaning. Was she genuinely surprised, or was this part of the careful political maneuvering that had led to my removal? Did she truly not know she was being promoted to replace me, or was this guilt disguised as innocence? The questions felt too complex for my current emotional state. I deleted the message without responding. The walk to my car felt like a journey through quicksand. Each step required conscious effort, as if my body was rebelling against the reality of leaving this place for the last time. The parking garage echoed with the sound of my footsteps, amplifying the loneliness that was beginning to settle in my chest like a physical weight. Sitting in my car, I placed the cardboard box on the passenger seat and stared at it. This was all I had to show for 27 years of service, for the sacrifices I had made, for the relationships I had damaged in pursuit of professional achievement. A box of personal trinkets and the knowledge that the technology I had created would continue to generate millions of dollars for people who had decided I was no longer worth employing. The engine started with a familiar rumble, and I sat in the parking garage for another 10 minutes, not ready to drive home, not ready to begin whatever came next. The silence felt different from the comfortable quiet of my laboratory. This was the silence of endings, of doors closing, of a life that had been redirected without my consent. When I finally drove away from MindBridge Dynamics, I didn't look back at the building in my rearview mirror. I couldn't bear to see it receding into the distance, taking with it everything I had thought I was. The apartment felt like a mausoleum when I finally returned home. I set the cardboard box on my kitchen counter and stared at it, unable to bring myself to unpack the remnants of my former life. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant hum of traffic and the periodic groaning of the building's aging heating system. I had grown so accustomed to the constant activity of the laboratory that the stillness felt unnatural, like holding my breath underwater. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat at my dining table, the same table where I had spread out research papers during countless late-night sessions, where I had sketched the first crude diagrams of the neural interface on napkins, where I had eaten solitary meals while reviewing patent applications. Now it felt like a relic from someone else's life. No! The severance package lay unopened on the table beside me, its manila envelope pristine and official. I couldn't bring myself to examine its contents, to quantify my worth in dollar amounts and benefit extensions. The very sight of it reminded me of Jessica's carefully modulated voice, of Dr. Webb's inability to meet my eyes, of the clinical efficiency with which they had discarded me. My laptop sat closed on the kitchen counter, its company logo suddenly feeling like a brand of ownership I no longer bore. Tomorrow, I would need to return it, along with my company phone and security badge. The thought of walking back into that building, of facing the same guards who had escorted me out, filled me with a dread that settled in my stomach like cold stone. But tonight, I couldn't think about tomorrow. Tonight, I needed to understand what had just happened to me, to process the reality that my career had been terminated with less consideration than most people gave to canceling a subscription service. I opened the laptop and began typing, not knowing what I was looking for, driven by the same methodical approach that had guided my research for decades. I started with the obvious questions. What were the legal implications of my termination? Had MindBridge followed proper procedures? Were there any protections for employees my age? The answers I found were discouraging but not surprising. Age discrimination was difficult to prove, especially when companies were careful to frame terminations in terms of strategic restructuring and, quote, cultural alignment. Then I moved to more specific questions about intellectual property rights. The neural interface technology had been developed during my employment at MindBridge, using company resources and facilities. Standard employment contracts typically assigned all intellectual property to the employer. But as I scrolled through legal databases and patent filings, something nagged at me, a half-remembered detail that I couldn't quite grasp. I walked to my home office, a small room that had served as my private workspace for years. The walls were lined with filing cabinets containing copies of every document I had ever signed, every contract I had ever negotiated, every patent application I had ever submitted. My father, a career military officer, had taught me to keep meticulous records. Paper doesn't lie, he used to say. People do, but paper tells the truth. I pulled out the file labeled MindBridge Employment 2016 to 2024 and spread its contents across my desk. Employment agreements, performance reviews, project authorizations, budget approvals, years of documentation that chronicled my relationship with the company. I worked methodically through each document, looking for something I couldn't yet name. The neural interface patent application was thick, nearly 200 pages of technical specifications, diagrams, and legal language. I had reviewed it countless times during the filing process, but now I read it with different eyes, searching for details that might have seemed irrelevant when I was still employed. On page 47, I found it. The invention disclosure form, dated 3 years earlier, bore my signature as the primary inventor. But below that was a section I had barely noticed during the original filing, prior art and independent development. The language was dense and technical, but the meaning was clear. I had documented that the foundational concepts for the neural interface had been developed during my military service, years before I joined MindBridge. My hands trembled as I pulled out another file, this one labeled Army Research 2003 to 2008. Inside were copies of my military research reports, including a preliminary study on brain-computer interfaces that I had conducted for the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. The study had been classified for years, but it had been declassified and released to the public domain in 2015. The implications hit me like a physical blow. The core technology underlying the neural interface, the algorithms for neural pattern recognition, the hardware design principles, the software architecture, had been developed using my military research as a foundation. MindBridge had provided the resources to refine and commercialize the technology, but they had never owned the fundamental intellectual property. I grabbed my personal laptop and began searching the Patent and Trademark Office database. The process was slow, requiring me to navigate through multiple search interfaces and cross-reference numerous filing numbers. But gradually, a picture emerged that made my chest tighten with possibility. I had filed a provisional patent application for the basic neural interface concept in 2014, 2 years before joining MindBridge. The application had been incomplete, lacking the detailed specifications needed for a full patent, but it had established a priority date for the core technology. When MindBridge had filed their comprehensive patent application 3 years later, they had built upon my foundational work, but they had never acquired the rights to the underlying intellectual property. The legal principle was called improvement patents. MindBridge owned the specific implementation of the neural interface, but I retained rights to the fundamental technology that made it possible. It was like owning the blueprint for a foundation while someone else owned the plans for the house built on top of it. I spent the next 4 hours researching precedent cases, reading court decisions, and cross-referencing patent law statutes. The picture that emerged was complex but encouraging. MindBridge's patent was valid, but it was dependent on my foundational work. Without access to my underlying technology, their patent was essentially worthless. More importantly, I discovered that my provisional patent application had been automatically converted to a full patent in 2017, when the patent office had updated their filing procedures. I had been so focused on the MindBridge patent that I had never followed up on my personal filing. But the patent was there, registered in my name, covering the essential elements of neural interface technology. I printed out the patent documents and spread them across my kitchen table. The official seal of the Patent and Trademark Office gleamed under my dining room light, and my name appeared in bold letters as the sole inventor. Patent number 10,847,392. Non-invasive neural interface system for brain-computer communication. The licensing agreement with Therapeutic Dynamics suddenly took on new meaning. They had negotiated with MindBridge for rights to technology that MindBridge didn't fully own. The contract was potentially invalid, or at minimum, it violated my intellectual property rights. I leaned back in my chair and allowed myself a smile for the first time since leaving the office. Jessica Thompson and Dr. Webb thought they had discarded a redundant employee. Instead, they had just terminated the only person who could legally authorize the use of the technology that generated their company's largest licensing deal. The neural interface patent wasn't just my greatest professional achievement. It was my weapon. The next morning, I woke before dawn with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. While most people might have spent the night wallowing in anger or self-pity, I had used the time to transform my discovery into a strategic advantage. The neural interface patent lay on my kitchen table like a chess piece that had been overlooked by my opponents, and I intended to use it with the precision that 27 years of engineering had taught me. I made coffee and opened my personal laptop, beginning the methodical process of researching MindBridge's competitors. If I was going to leverage my patent, I needed to understand the marketplace, identify potential partners, and determine which companies had both the resources and the motivation to challenge MindBridge's dominance in neural interface technology. Therapeutic Dynamics topped my list, but not for the reasons MindBridge assumed. While they had signed the licensing agreement, their legal team was notoriously thorough. If they discovered that MindBridge didn't own the foundational technology they had licensed, the resulting legal battle would be devastating. More importantly, Therapeutic Dynamics had the financial resources to acquire my patent and the market position to commercialize it independently. I spent 2 hours drafting a careful email to Dr. Amanda Foster, Therapeutic Dynamics' Chief Scientific Officer. I had met her at conferences over the years, and she had always struck me as someone who valued substance over politics. The message was brief and professional, mentioning my recent departure from MindBridge and my interest in discussing potential collaboration opportunities related to neural interface technology. I didn't mention the patent. Not yet. That information was too valuable to share in an initial email. Instead, I focused on my experience and availability, presenting myself as a senior researcher looking for new opportunities. Dr. Foster would need to meet with me in person before I revealed the full scope of what I was offering. The second email went to Dr. Kenneth Liu at Biotech Solutions, MindBridge's most aggressive competitor. Their company had been trying to develop neural interface technology for years, but they had always been a step behind MindBridge's research. With my patent, they could leapfrog directly to the front of the market. Dr. Liu was known for his willingness to take risks, and he had the kind of entrepreneurial instincts that would immediately recognize the value of what I possessed. I also reached out to Dr. Rachel Morrison at Synapse Innovations, a smaller company that specialized in assistive technologies for disabled veterans. Their focus aligned perfectly with my original motivation for developing the neural interface, and they had established relationships with the Department of Veterans Affairs that could facilitate rapid clinical trials. More importantly, they were small enough that acquiring my patent could transform their entire business model. Each email was carefully crafted to generate interest without revealing my true intentions. I presented myself as a recently available researcher with extensive experience in neural interface technology, someone who might be interested in consulting arrangements or research partnerships. The responses came within hours, confirming what I had suspected. My reputation in the field was strong enough that my sudden availability was seen as an opportunity, not a red flag. While waiting for meeting requests, I turned my attention to monitoring MindBridge's activities. I had maintained friendships with several researchers who still worked there, and I began reaching out to them under the guise of staying in touch. The information I gathered painted a picture of a company that was already beginning to struggle with the transition. Dr. Marcus Webb, a senior researcher in the robotics division, mentioned during a casual phone call that Sarah Chen was having difficulty managing the neural interface team, The project timeline had slipped by 3 weeks, and 2 key researchers had requested transfers to other divisions. More troubling, the FDA had raised questions about the clinical trial protocols, questions that Sarah was struggling to answer without my institutional knowledge. My former assistant, Jennifer Park, texted me that the laboratory was operating at reduced capacity because several pieces of equipment had malfunctioned, and no one else knew how to repair them. I had performed all the maintenance myself, keeping detailed service logs that were apparently stored only on my now-deleted company computer. The replacement parts alone would cost MindBridge over $50,000, assuming they could even identify which components needed replacement. But the most revealing information came from Tom Rodriguez, a project coordinator who had worked with me on the licensing negotiations. During a brief coffee meeting, he mentioned that Therapeutic Dynamics had been asking increasingly detailed questions about the patent filing process. Their legal team wanted to review the complete patent history, including all provisional applications and prior art declarations. "They're being really thorough," Tom said, stirring sugar into his coffee. "More thorough than usual. It's like they're looking for something specific." I nodded sympathetically, but internally I was calculating timelines. If Therapeutic Dynamics was conducting a comprehensive patent review, they would discover my foundational patent within days. Once they realized that MindBridge had licensed technology they didn't fully own, the legal implications would be immediate and severe. The beauty of my position was that I didn't need to actively sabotage MindBridge. I simply needed to wait for the natural consequences of their actions to unfold. They had terminated the only person who understood the complex intellectual property landscape surrounding the neural interface technology. Now they would have to navigate that landscape without my guidance, and their ignorance would be their undoing. I spent the afternoon reviewing my financial situation, calculating how long I could afford to remain unemployed while pursuing my patent strategy. The severance package, combined with my savings and the small royalty payments from my previous patents, would sustain me for at least 6 months. More importantly, if I could license my neural interface patent to a MindBridge competitor, the resulting revenue would dwarf my previous salary. By evening, I had received meeting requests from all 3 companies I had contacted. Dr. Foster wanted to meet the following week. Dr. Liu suggested a lunch meeting in 3 days. Dr. Morrison offered to fly to my city for a breakfast meeting at my convenience. The level of interest confirmed that the market value of my expertise was significantly higher than MindBridge had recognized. I scheduled the meetings strategically, spacing them out to allow me to learn from each conversation and refine my approach. Dr. Morrison would be first, since Synapse Innovations was the smallest company and therefore the lowest risk for testing my presentation. Dr. Liu would be second, giving me an opportunity to gauge the level of interest from a major competitor. Dr. Foster would be last, when I was most prepared to negotiate with the company that had the most to lose from my defection. As I closed my laptop and prepared for bed, I felt a satisfaction that had nothing to do with revenge. This was about restoring balance, about ensuring that experience and expertise were properly valued. MindBridge had made the mistake of thinking they could discard me without consequences. They were about to learn that in the world of intellectual property, ownership mattered more than employment status. I had spent my entire career building technologies that helped people. Now I was going to use those same skills to rebuild my own professional future, one strategic decision at a time. The meeting with Dr. Rachel Morrison took place in a quiet corner booth at the Meridian Hotel restaurant, where the soft lighting and muted conversations provided the perfect backdrop for sensitive discussions. Dr. Morrison arrived precisely on time, a woman in her mid-40s with graying hair and the kind of focused intensity that came from years of working with wounded veterans. "Dr. Martinez," she said, extending her hand with a firm grip, "I've been following your work for years. Your neural interface research has been groundbreaking." I had rehearsed this conversation, but sitting across from someone who genuinely understood the implications of my technology made the words flow naturally. "Thank you, Dr. Morrison. I'm at a transition point in my career, and I'm interested in exploring opportunities with organizations that share my commitment to helping veterans." Over the course of 2 hours, I gradually revealed the scope of what I was offering. I explained my departure from MindBridge in general terms, focusing on philosophical differences about research priorities rather than the specifics of my termination. When I mentioned that I held independent patent rights to foundational neural interface technology, Dr. Morrison's coffee cup stopped halfway to her lips. "Independent rights?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. I was under the impression that MindBridge held comprehensive patents for neural interface technology. "They hold patents for specific implementations," I replied, sliding a copy of my patent documentation across the table. "But the underlying technology is independently owned." Dr. Morrison studied the documents with the intensity of someone who recognized a game-changing opportunity. Her fingers traced the patent numbers, and I could see her mind calculating the implications. Synapse Innovations had been trying to develop neural interface technology for 3 years, but they had always been blocked by MindBridge's intellectual property portfolio. My patent provided a pathway around those restrictions. "This is remarkable," she said finally. "With this foundational technology, we could develop our own implementations without infringing on MindBridge's patents." "More than that," I said, leaning forward. "Any company that wants to use neural interface technology would need to license both my foundational patent and MindBridge's implementation patents. That creates a significant competitive advantage for early partners." By the time we finished our meeting, Dr. Morrison had outlined a potential partnership structure that would give me both consulting fees and royalty percentages. More importantly, she had agreed to fast-track the legal review process, promising to have her intellectual property attorneys examine my patents within 48 hours. The meeting with Dr. Kenneth Liu was scheduled for the following afternoon at his downtown office. Biotech Solutions occupied 3 floors of a gleaming glass tower, and their lobby displayed prototypes of medical devices that represented millions of dollars in research investment. Dr. Liu greeted me personally, a tall man with silver hair and the kind of aggressive energy that had built his company from a startup into a major player in the biotech industry. "Elena," he said, using my first name immediately in a way that suggested we were already partners. "I have to admit, when I heard you were available, I cleared my afternoon schedule. Your reputation precedes you." His office overlooked the city skyline, and the walls were covered with patents and awards that chronicled Biotech Solutions' growth. As we talked, I realized that Dr. Liu had been following my work more closely than I had expected. He knew about the therapeutic dynamics licensing deal, about the clinical trial timelines, even about some of the technical challenges I had overcome during development. "I'm going to be direct with you," he said after I had outlined my situation. "We've been trying to develop neural interface technology for years, but we've always been hampered by MindBridge's patent portfolio. If what you're telling me is accurate, your foundational patent could change everything." I provided him with the same documentation I had shown Dr. Morrison, watching his expression shift from interest to excitement to calculated determination. Dr. Liu was known for his willingness to take aggressive action when he identified market opportunities, and I could see him already formulating strategies for leveraging my patent. "How quickly could you begin consulting for us?" he asked, pulling out his phone to check his calendar. "We have a neural interface project that's been stalled for 8 months. With your expertise, we could have a working prototype within 6 weeks." "That depends on the terms of our arrangement," I replied, maintaining the professional distance that would allow me to negotiate from a position of strength. "I'm exploring several options." Dr. Liu's eyes sharpened. "What kind of options?" "I'm in discussions with multiple companies about licensing my patent rights. The terms will depend on factors like exclusivity, market territory, and development timelines." The transformation in his demeanor was immediate. Dr. Liu leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting from enthusiasm to calculation. "Elena, I hope you understand that time is a critical factor here. The neural interface market is evolving rapidly, and early partnerships will determine which companies dominate the field." "I'm very aware of the market dynamics," I said calmly. "That's why I'm taking the time to evaluate all my options carefully." While I was conducting these meetings, the situation at MindBridge was deteriorating more rapidly than I had anticipated. Tom Rodriguez called me on Wednesday evening, his voice tight with stress. "Elena, I probably shouldn't be telling you this, but things are falling apart here. Sarah Chen is completely overwhelmed. She's working 18-hour days, but she doesn't have the institutional knowledge to manage the neural interface program effectively." "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, though internally I felt a grim satisfaction. "What's happening specifically?" The FDA rejected our clinical trial protocol. They want detailed explanations of the safety testing procedures, and Sarah can't answer their questions. She's been trying to reconstruct your testing methodology from your old reports, but she's missing crucial details. This was exactly what I had expected. The clinical trial protocols were based on years of accumulated knowledge about neural interface safety, knowledge that existed primarily in my memory rather than in documented form. I had always meant to create comprehensive documentation, but the day-to-day pressures of research had prevented me from completing that task. There's more, Tom continued. The Therapeutic Dynamics licensing deal is under review. Their legal team has been asking questions about the patent history, and they're not satisfied with the answers they're getting. I felt a surge of anticipation. If Therapeutic Dynamics was conducting a thorough patent review, they would discover my foundational patent within days. Once they realized that MindBridge had licensed technology they didn't fully own, the legal implications would be immediate and severe. Tom, I appreciate you keeping me informed, but I can't really comment on MindBridge's internal affairs. I'm no longer employed there. I know. It's just frustrating to watch everything you built start to crumble. Sarah is a brilliant researcher, but she's not ready for this level of responsibility. After ending the call, I sat in my kitchen and allowed myself a moment of satisfaction. MindBridge had thought they could discard me without consequences. They had assumed that my decades of experience could be easily replaced by youthful enthusiasm. Now they were learning that expertise couldn't be transferred through job titles or organizational charts. But the real vindication would come when the patent review was complete, when the legal implications of their decision became clear. I didn't need to actively sabotage MindBridge. I simply needed to wait for the natural consequences of their actions to unfold. The chess game was progressing exactly as I had planned. The call came at 7:43 on a Thursday morning, jarring me from the first peaceful sleep I'd had in weeks. The number on my phone display was unfamiliar, but the voice that greeted me was unmistakably professional and urgent. Dr. Martinez, this is Catherine Walsh, Chief Legal Counsel for Therapeutic Dynamics. I need to meet with you immediately regarding your neural interface patent. I sat up in bed, instantly alert. Good morning, Ms. Walsh. What can I do for you? Dr. Martinez, we've conducted a comprehensive review of the intellectual property surrounding the neural interface technology we licensed from MindBridge. We've discovered some significant discrepancies that require immediate discussion. The tone in her voice told me everything I needed to know. Therapeutic Dynamics had found my foundational patent, and they were not pleased with MindBridge's failure to disclose its existence during the licensing negotiations. I'm available to meet at your convenience, I said, already calculating the implications of this conversation. Can you be at our offices by 10 o'clock this morning? This is a matter of extreme urgency. 2 hours later, I sat in the executive conference room of Therapeutic Dynamics, facing a team of lawyers and executives who looked like they had been working through the night. Ms. Walsh was a woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and the kind of sharp intelligence that came from years of high-stakes legal negotiations. Dr. Martinez, she began, sliding a thick folder across the polished conference table. We've discovered that you hold patent 10,847,392 for the foundational neural interface technology that forms the basis of the system we licensed from MindBridge. I opened the folder and found copies of my patent documentation, along with detailed legal analysis that outlined the implications of MindBridge's licensing agreement. The lawyers had been thorough, cross-referencing every claim in both patents and identifying the dependencies that MindBridge had failed to disclose. That's correct, I said calmly. I filed the provisional application in 2014, and it was converted to a full patent in 2017. Were you aware that MindBridge was licensing technology that depended on your patent when you were employed there? Asked David Chen, Therapeutic Dynamics Chief Technology Officer. I was not involved in the licensing negotiations, I replied carefully. I was focused on the technical development of the neural interface system. Ms. Walsh leaned forward, her expression intense. Dr. Martinez, MindBridge's patent is essentially worthless without access to your foundational technology. They've licensed us rights to a system that they cannot legally implement without your permission. The room fell silent as the implications settled over the assembled executives. Therapeutic Dynamics had paid $47 million for rights to technology that was legally compromised. The licensing agreement was either invalid or would require renegotiation to include my patent rights. What are your intentions regarding your patent? Ms. Walsh asked, her voice carefully neutral. I'm currently exploring licensing opportunities with several companies, I said. I'm interested in working with organizations that share my commitment to helping veterans and disabled individuals. Would you be willing to discuss exclusive licensing terms with Therapeutic Dynamics? Asked Dr. Foster, who had been silent throughout the meeting. We believe your technology could revolutionize our veteran rehabilitation programs. I paused, considering the offer. Therapeutic Dynamics had the resources and market position to fully commercialize my technology, but exclusivity would limit my options and potentially reduce the competitive pressure that was driving up the licensing value. I would be open to discussing terms, I said finally, but I would need to understand the full scope of what you're proposing. The next 2 hours were spent in detailed negotiations. Ms. Walsh outlined a licensing structure that would provide me with both upfront payments and ongoing royalties, while Dr. Foster described the clinical applications that would utilize my technology. By the end of the meeting, I had agreed to a 30-day exclusive negotiation period, during which Therapeutic Dynamics would have the first opportunity to license my patent. As I prepared to leave, Ms. Walsh made a comment that sent a chill through my chest. Dr. Martinez, you should know that we'll be terminating our licensing agreement with MindBridge effective immediately. Their failure to disclose your patent constitutes a material breach of contract. The drive back to my apartment felt like floating on air. Therapeutic Dynamics' decision to terminate their licensing agreement would devastate MindBridge's financial projections and potentially trigger a cascade of legal challenges. The $47 million deal that had been celebrated as the company's greatest achievement was about to become their greatest liability. My phone rang before I reached my front door. Dr. Webb's name appeared on the display, and I almost didn't answer, but curiosity overcame my distaste for speaking with him. Elena, he said, his voice strained in a way I had never heard before. We need to talk. Can you come in this afternoon? I'm no longer employed by MindBridge, I reminded him. I don't think there's anything we need to discuss. Elena, please. We've just received notice that Therapeutic Dynamics is terminating the licensing agreement. They're claiming that we failed to disclose essential patent dependencies. We need to understand what's happening. I felt a moment of genuine pity for him. Dr. Webb was a competent researcher and a decent manager, but he had allowed himself to be manipulated by Jessica Thompson's corporate politics. Now he was facing the consequences of decisions he had probably opposed in private. Harrison, I think you should speak with your legal counsel about this matter. I'm not in a position to provide guidance on MindBridge's business affairs. Elena, I know we handled your departure poorly. I know you're angry, and you have every right to be. But please, we need to understand what Therapeutic Dynamics is talking about. They're claiming that you hold patent rights to the neural interface technology. I do hold patent rights, I said calmly. Patent 10,847,392, filed in 2014, covers the foundational neural interface technology. I'm surprised your legal team wasn't aware of this. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for nearly 30 seconds. When Dr. Webb finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Elena, what are you planning to do? I'm exploring licensing opportunities with companies that value my expertise, I said. Companies that understand that experience and knowledge are assets, not liabilities. Elena, please. We can discuss reinstating your position. We can negotiate a consulting arrangement. We can work something out. Harrison, you made it very clear that I was no longer aligned with MindBridge's vision for the future. I'm simply pursuing opportunities that are better aligned with my goals. I ended the call and sat in my car for several minutes, processing what had just happened. 6 weeks ago, I had been terminated for being too old, too inflexible, too focused on past achievements. Now MindBridge was begging me to return, recognizing too late that they had discarded the one person who could protect their most valuable asset. The irony was perfect. In their effort to modernize and embrace youth, they had destroyed the foundation of their own success. They had traded decades of experience for the illusion of innovation, and now they were learning that some assets couldn't be replaced with enthusiasm and energy. But I was no longer interested in saving MindBridge from the consequences of their decisions. I was interested in building a future where my expertise was properly valued, where my contributions were recognized, where age was seen as an asset rather than a liability. The exclusive licensing agreement with Therapeutic Dynamics was signed on a crisp Tuesday morning in their executive boardroom, with enough legal witnesses present to formalize what would become the most significant patent licensing deal in neural interface history. The terms were extraordinary: $15 million up front, with royalty payments that would guarantee me financial security for the rest of my life, plus a consulting arrangement that would allow me to guide the clinical implementation of my technology. Dr. Foster shook my hand after the final signatures were completed, her expression reflecting the satisfaction of someone who had just secured a decisive competitive advantage. Elena, I want you to know that this partnership means we can fast-track clinical trials for veteran rehabilitation programs. Your neural interface technology will be helping patients within 18 months. The mention of veterans brought back memories of Marcus, the young soldier whose death had started this journey 20 years ago. The neural interface technology would finally fulfill the promise I had made to his photograph, helping wounded warriors reclaim their lives from the invisible injuries that traditional medicine couldn't touch. As I walked out of the Therapeutic Dynamics building, I felt a profound sense of completion. Not the hollow satisfaction of revenge, but the deeper fulfillment that comes from seeing years of work reach its intended purpose. The technology I had created would help thousands of veterans, and I would be personally involved in ensuring its proper implementation. The news of my licensing deal reached MindBridge within hours, and the impact was immediate and devastating. The termination of the Therapeutic Dynamics contract had already triggered a financial crisis, but losing exclusive access to my foundational patent made their entire neural interface division essentially worthless. Their stock price dropped 37% in a single trading session, and the board of directors called an emergency meeting to address what financial analysts were calling, quote, a catastrophic failure of intellectual property management. I learned about MindBridge's collapse through Tom Rodriguez, who called me 3 days after the signing. His voice carried the exhaustion of someone who had watched his company implode in real time. Elena, it's a disaster here. Jessica Thompson was fired yesterday. Dr. Webb submitted his resignation this morning. The entire neural interface division is being shut down, and they're laying off 46 researchers. I felt a pang of sympathy for the researchers who would lose their jobs, but I also recognized that MindBridge's problems were entirely self-inflicted. They had chosen to prioritize image over substance, youth over experience, and politics over competence. The consequences were simply the natural result of their decisions. I'm sorry to hear that people are losing their jobs, I said genuinely. That's never easy. Elena, there's something else. Sarah Chen was let go this morning. She's only been the research director for 6 weeks, but they're blaming her for the project failures. It's not fair. She never had a chance to succeed. The news about Sarah affected me more deeply than I had expected. She was a brilliant young researcher who had been caught in the crossfire of corporate politics. Her career would recover, but the experience would leave scars that might take years to heal. That evening, I called Sarah directly. Her voice was raw with exhaustion and disappointment when she answered. Dr. Martinez, I'm so sorry about everything that happened. I never wanted to replace you. I didn't even know about the promotion until after you were gone. Sarah, I know you weren't involved in the decision. You're a talented researcher, and this setback doesn't define your career. I don't know what I'm going to do now. My reputation is destroyed. Who's going to hire someone who failed so spectacularly as a research director? I am, I said without hesitation. Therapeutic Dynamics is building a new neural interface research team, and I'll be leading it. I'd like you to be my deputy director. The silence on the other end of the line lasted nearly 30 seconds. When Sarah finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. Dr. Martinez, I don't deserve that kind of trust. I failed at MindBridge. Sarah, you didn't fail. You were set up to fail by people who didn't understand what they were doing. There's a difference. Over the following weeks, I began building the research team at Therapeutic Dynamics. I hired not just Sarah, but also Jennifer Park, my former assistant, and Dr. Marcus Webb from the robotics division. I specifically sought out older researchers who had been marginalized by the tech industry's obsession with youth, creating a team that balanced experience with innovation. The laboratory facilities at Therapeutic Dynamics were state-of-the-art, with equipment that surpassed anything I had worked with at MindBridge. But more importantly, the corporate culture valued expertise and supported long-term research goals. I had the resources and freedom to pursue the kind of comprehensive development that would maximize the technology's potential for helping veterans. 6 months later, I stood in the new neural interface laboratory, watching Sarah conduct a training session for our clinical staff. She had grown into her role as deputy director, combining her technical brilliance with the leadership skills that came from surviving professional adversity. The team we had built was conducting research that would have been impossible at MindBridge, where political considerations had often trumped scientific merit. The first clinical trial was scheduled to begin in 2 months, with a focus on veterans with traumatic brain injuries. The Department of Veterans Affairs had fast-tracked our approval process, recognizing the potential impact of the technology on their patient population. We would be helping the same demographic that had originally inspired my research, fulfilling the promise I had made to Marcus 2 decades earlier. My phone buzzed with a text message from Dr. Patricia Holmes, my old Army colleague. "Elena, I just read about your new position at Therapeutic Dynamics. Marcus would be proud of what you've accomplished." I smiled, remembering the young soldier whose struggle had set me on this path. The neural interface technology would soon be helping veterans like him, providing them with tools to rebuild their lives after devastating injuries. It had taken 20 years, but I had finally kept my promise. As I walked through the laboratory, I felt a satisfaction that had nothing to do with defeating MindBridge or vindicating my termination. This was about fulfilling a purpose that transcended corporate politics and personal vindication. I was exactly where I belonged, doing exactly what I had always been meant to do. The betrayal at MindBridge had been devastating, but it had also been liberating. It had forced me to recognize my own value and fight for the recognition I deserved. Most importantly, it had led me to a position where I could make a greater impact than I had ever imagined possible. Though Sachland, at 63, I wasn't too old to innovate. I wasn't too old to lead. I wasn't too old to change the world. I was exactly the right age to combine decades of experience with the wisdom that comes from surviving professional adversity. The neural interface technology would help thousands of veterans reclaim their lives, and I would be there to guide every step of that process, ensuring that the promise made to a dying soldier would finally be kept. If this story of resilience, expertise, and quiet victory resonated with you, please subscribe to my channel for more inspiring stories of people who overcame professional setbacks and age discrimination to achieve their greatest successes. Your support helps me continue sharing these powerful narratives of triumph over adversity.